For those of you who haven't come to our webinars before, we are in a reach. We serve a dual mission of both developing the profession and professional development. So the idea is to bring together people who make cross-disciplinary problem solving possible to share practices, tools, and ideas for strengthening this work. It's really a community of practice for folks who engage in this kind of boundary spanning cross-disciplinary work. Let's see. So this year for our webinars, so every year we do a webinar series where once a month we get together and have some sort of dialogue or talk about the field. And this year we decided to celebrate I2 Insights turning 10 years old. So I2 Insights is a blog led by Gabrielle Bammer and Peter Dean of Australian National University to really share ideas and tools for integration and implementation sciences. And so we're just really here to celebrate the impact that this blog has had over the last 10 years by inviting speakers based on previous blog posts. So these seminars take a very interactive format. So basically, each panelist will give a 10-minute presentation of kind of what their blog post was about or what their research is about. And following that, the panelists will have a 10 to 15-minute dialogue between themselves. And after that, we will open it up for community discussion with everybody. So with that background, I want to introduce our topic today, which is I2 Insights on Leadership Practices for Collaborative Teams with Gemma Jiang from Colorado State University and Gerald Midgley from the University of Hull. So I'll start by introducing Dr. Gemma Jiang. She is a team science leadership expert specializing in coaching and facilitating cross-disciplinary research teams addressing complex scientific and societal challenges. She holds a PhD in complexity leadership from Clemson University and currently serves as a senior team scientist at Colorado State University. She has extensive experience supporting NSF and NIH funded projects, and her work strengthens collaborative capacity, builds coherence and vision alignment, and cultivates adaptive leadership practices that help teams navigate uncertainty, integrate diverse expertise, and accelerate scientific progress. So with that, I will turn it over to Gemma as our first speaker of the hour.
Hey, thank you, Kim. Okay, so let me start sharing. Great to be with everyone. Good to see familiar faces. This is the community has nurtured me. Oh, what happened to my? Okay, here you go, here you go. And also good to see new friends. So I would say InterReach and I2 Insights are the two biggest community that has really nurtured my growth. So deeply grateful that these two are coming together. So so I'm going to talk like briefly about my history with I2 Insights since this is I2 Insights 10-year anniversary. And then I will talk a little bit about complex leadership theory where I operate from. So I have been publishing with I2 Insights since 2021. And it is really the platform that has witnessed my entire growth. So my team, I just say this story real quick. My team science career started in January 2020. So I was a co-PI on the first cohort of NSF's Growing Convergence Research, like a new program. And that awardee meeting in January was the last meeting we had before we went into COVID lockdown. And that was also the first meeting where I heard the term team science from Michael O'Rourke. So just about a year later, my first post on I2 Insights appeared in February of 2022. And since then, I have had 16 posts and one coming in the pipeline in August. So, and they really are all centered around the complexity leadership as like the attractor, right? That everything is organized around. So my first post, as you would imagine, surprise, was talking about complexity and convergence, right? So complexity leadership theory as a theory and convergence research as the practice field. So bring the two of them together. So there I talk about ecosystem awareness, which ties, I think, very nicely to Gerald's presentation and it being a positive sum game instead of zero sum game and the concept of emergence. So this remains to be my most widely read article, and I heard the most feedback I have received from the community. So that was my my first. And then I dove straight down to like practice, deep in the weeds, right? So practice methods, tools. So how to? So basically this period of posts is all about how to, very detailed, like how to enable divergence convergence thinking, how to develop proposal, how to develop facilitation capacity, how do you transform resistance, down to one specific method in how you can transform resistance. How do you enhance mutual learning? How do you generate new projects? How do you organize a meeting? How do you navigate uncertainty? Right? So it's all like very practical know-hows. So, and then at some point, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, I realized, I'm a leadership scholar, right? So you can see when I graduated with my PhD, I was like, I don't want to be a scholar. I want to be a practitioner. I really want to see real difference made in practice from this wonderful theory that I learned, right? And then, so I dove head in. And at some point, I reconnected with my identity as being a leadership scholar. I said, I can own the space of a complex leadership in team science, really thinking about how we think about team science, the social system we establish as a complex adaptive system and how we enable optimal performance in such systems. So that's where I started to really the new series of posts, the latest series in the past 2 3 years, have really been focused on transforming experts to science leaders. Right? We often say we have such a terrible assumption in team science that if they are good individual contributors, they're good at their science, they're good leaders. Totally don't hold. Right? It's a transformation process. So there I talk about boundary spanning, role clarity, style fluidity, conscious leadership, co-active coaching, polarity thinking. So those are all very much aimed at developing the capacity and a new identity as being a science leader, in addition to the outstanding scientific contribution you make. These are two different things. So that is like a very quick summary of all my I2 Insights posts. So my 6.5 year team science career overlaps with the 10 years that of I2 Insights. Really grateful for the platform. So then I would say just say something very quick about complex leadership theory. Oh, actually, I have more time than I thought, I think. Okay, I'm always worried I run out of time. So okay, here you go. So when you think about what complexity leadership theory about is really about leading change, influencing change, right? So that's my doctoral advisor, Dr. Marion. He coined the term. He taught me everything I know about complex leadership theory. And his definition of leadership is the ability to influence change. Right. So when you think about it, we want to introduce something into the system. When you introduce like a new practice, let's say, okay, so the system, you can have the outcome. There could be an order response or could be an adaptive response, right? An order response basically is it went back to what it was, right? Through adaptive pressure ignored. I just explained it away. I talk about COVID. COVID didn't happen. It's not something new. We explained that adaptive pressure, right? And we introduce a quick fix, right? Or the new idea just hit that proverbial brick wall, or it may be able to generate a little bit of a bubble here and there, but it just like localized. It does not get introduced to the bigger system that form a new adaptive response, right? So adaptive response would be the system really upgraded, right? It became a new it reconfigured a new ways of working and relating and being that really responded to the adaptive pressure. So that is the challenge. So what complex leadership conceptualizes is it's really about the change stability polarity, right? So change is important and it is represented by the entrepreneurial leadership, right? So there's always this new adaptive pressure that is coming in. It can be from outside, a change in the context. It could also come from inside the system that, we just came up through observation and sense making, we came up with new way of doing things. Regardless, the system has a need to change. Okay, so that's represented by the entrepreneurial leadership. And there is the operational system, operational leadership. They represent the need for stability. System needs to standardize. It needs to be efficiency. It needs to produce results, right? That is also an important need of a system. So how do we manage the tension? Turn the tension to be productive instead of destructive, because these could be the tension could be destructive, right? So then the answer, that is the tagline from complex leadership theory, is we need to introduce a new kind of leadership called enabling leadership that holds the adaptive space, that negotiates between entrepreneurial leadership as the tendency for change and operational leadership as a tendency to stability, right? So this is a much needed space so that we can continue along the line of emergence. So that's basically the gist of complex leadership theory. So we call it, in the theory, we call it the adaptive space instead of adaptive system. As you say, we call it entrepreneurial system and operational system, but we call it space to really call out that fluid, dynamic, and liminal nature of this space, right? It really just talks more of the dynamic aspect of it instead of the more stable and static aspect of the system. So so that is the complex leadership in a nutshell. And this connects echoes right back to my current work in polarity. Is basically complex leadership is a specific theory specifically addressing change stability as a polarity, right? Where there are many, 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 many other polarities and many, many other ways to negotiate the change stability polarity as well. So, okay, I'll just take a pause here. Hand it back to Kim.
Great. Thank you, Gemma. Let me Great. So our next speaker is Dr. Gerald Midgley, who is an independent consultant, writer, and emeritus professor of systems thinking in the Center for Systems Studies, at University of Hull, UK. He also holds visiting professorships at the University of Birmingham, the Australian National University. Correct me if I mispronounce this, but Linnaeus University. He has held research leadership roles in UK academia and New England government and has undertaken a wide variety of public policy, public health, and natural resource management, community development, and technology foresight projects. He has written or edited 12 books and almost 400 papers and is a past president of the International Society for the System Sciences. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerald Midgley.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and it's an honor to be part of this. Let me just share my screen. And find the slideshow. There we go. So I haven't made the huge contribution that Gemma has to this series. I've had 3 blogs in the process, 2 about systems thinking in co-creation and co-design, and 1 with Kathy Hobbs on systems thinking for leadership. Now, in that work on systems thinking for leadership, we were pretty much introducing different systems approaches that leaders might pick up, which was back how I was thinking about it when we wrote that blog maybe 6 years ago or so. And I really want to take quite a few steps forward from that thinking. I still have incorporated the work with Kathy in this presentation, but I want to talk about some of the ideas that I've been developing in partnership with colleagues at the University of Birmingham. So there's 5 staff and 5 PhD students I'm working there with there, including actually one of my students is in the audience today, and that has been really fruitful collaboration because it's allowed me to really think much more deeply about what systemic leadership might be and how systems thinking might be used for systemic leadership. So I want to really cover 2 things. I want to say something about what a system is, very brief introduction, which will throw some new light on what the systemic properties of leadership can be. And then that should make it clear how systems thinking can support systemic leadership. So this is a simple representation of a system. It might sound a little abstract when I talk about it generically, but I'll get into a description of a team to make it a bit more grounded. So a system has a number of different interacting parts. So there are relationships involved in the way the parts interact. The system has a boundary, which means that you can say what's inside or outside the system, even temporarily, and it might be contested, but there are boundaries that can be identified. There's an emergent property of a system, which means there's some kind of outcome from the system that can only be attributed to the system as a whole. It can't be just attributed to one part of the system. And that's really the definition of a system, that it has emergent properties. And systems are always seen from a perspective. So I've drawn a little person down in there looking at the system, but actually she's not external to the system. Systems are always viewed from within, which means that if people are situated, have positionality in systems, they always have a partial perspective. They're partial in the sense of never a complete understanding. They draw boundaries in different ways. They appreciate different perspectives. They only see some relationships, some emergent properties, and partial in the sense that what they think ought to be done or what sort of action should be pursued will be dependent on that positionality. So that kind of self-reflective process of understanding more of the complexity that we're kind of swimming in within the system is crucial to systemic leadership. So that's the basic system idea, and you can see a team like this. These could be members of teams, all in a relationship. As I said, the boundary could be contested. You could be talking about partners that may be sometimes inside the team, sometimes out, other stakeholders, sometimes in, sometimes out. You can use the systems idea to understand the organizational context, maybe multiple organizations interacting as part where a team kind of draws across multiple organizations. And individuals are systems too, in the sense that they exist in a wider relational context, and they have perception, thinking, feeling. They interpret their feeling as emotion, and all of this, on all of their anticipation of what action is necessary, is based on their history of experience. So these elements in the person could be elements of their past experience that gives rise to their emergent action. So you can really use the systems idea in a generic way to look at any kind of configuration of individuals in relation to teams, in relation to wider contexts, and you can play around with those kinds of boundaries. So if that's the basic idea, we can actually look at what then are the key assumptions about leadership in teams. And if you take the typical MBA text that is taught on leadership, something like Northhouse's book on leadership, if you look in that, you'll see that the large majority of leadership theories in that are really about individual characteristics and individual behaviors, and that this is not about that. It's always relational. Even when we're talking about individuals, we're talking about individuals in the context of teams, wider systems, and making sense. And actually thinking in terms of systems is about making sense of the complexity we're in. Even leader-member exchange theory, which kind of acknowledges followers, it's still quite reductive because it talks about dyads between individual followers and leaders. And we're talking about a much more systemic understanding of emergence between people as they interact in systems. So one of the key assumptions in systemic leadership needs to be that leadership is not the property of a senior person in a hierarchy. Everybody exercises leadership in relation to everybody else, and who everybody else is a matter of how we perceive people, how we actually understand, how we anticipate what others do, and therefore how we act, and how we then create behavior individually and collectively as within systems. So if that's our basic understanding of a system, of a team and how a team works, we can think about a framework for systems thinking, which is really quite basic. We don't have to go into a great deal of detail about a complex methodology here. And I just want to offer you the idea of 3 layers of systems thinking. So there's the basic systems idea that I've already talked about. It helps us see things in terms of systems. Then there's the systems thinking skills, which are really about rethinking systems. So you can really rethink the boundaries, rethink the perspectives that people are seeing, rethink the relationships that matter, rethink what people see as emergent. And then there are various kind of systems methodologies and workshop processes that are useful for particular purposes. But this framework is useful because the entry point is very basic. It's just what I gave you in the first 5 minutes. And then you can deepen the practice through learning systems thinking skills, which is kind of reflecting on your understanding and changing your understanding. And then if you want to go further into a really more advanced practice, you can learn systems methodologies too. So the basic systems idea I've already explained. One of the things that Ray Eisen talks about, who's somebody who's influenced me in relation to this, is how if you simply see the system as some kind of thing external to yourself and you just take for granted one perspective of the system, it's very, very limiting in terms of leadership. How do you know, for example, that you've got the right people in your team in the first place? How do you know that you're actually having the right kind of stakeholder relationships unless you actually can have some rethinking of the system? And that's where these kinds of concepts come in, because you can begin to draw out key concepts like boundary, relationship, emergence, perspective, and think about how you can explore those things. So here you get some systems thinking skills. You can talk about exploring boundaries, mapping relationships, understanding different emergent properties and appreciating different perspectives. And just to give you a couple of examples from a team context, with exploring boundaries, this can be, for example, about insider-outsider relationships, processes of marginalization. It's a lovely piece of work by Amalia Turner, who showed that differences in teams can be managed productively in terms of inclusive processes where tensions are worked with, or they can be managed in terms of marginalization, where some people become insiders and some people become outsiders, and it can become quite destructive. Likewise, Alice McGillivray talks about hierarchies in organizations and how they try to marginalize horizontal stakeholder relationships. But similarly, stakeholder networks try to marginalize the concerns that go on about hierarchical management in organizations. So there are these tensions that you get with exploring boundaries. Perspectives can be different disciplinary perspectives. It can be academic and practitioner perspectives, different stakeholder perspectives, relationships. Who do you work with, and to what end? What sort of roles are people taking? Is it just people? Or are you talking about relationships with technology, relationships with ecosystems, relationships with communities? Um, the notion of understanding systems and emergence, we often think about what teams produce in terms of outcomes, innovation, and those are the kind of positive forms of emergence we try to foster. But we can also have negative forms of emergence, like stress, dysfunctional relationships. We can actually form such intense team relationships that we create competition with others that might be destructive. So you can actually see that you can detach these thinking skills from the original systems idea and use them quite creatively to explore multiple issues in both team relationships and in relation to the issues and context that the team finds itself, and in relation to understanding the systems of activities that have to be developed in order to create system change. So I'm going to end with a slide that shows, this is the work that I did with Kathy Hobbs before, showing how there are various different systems approaches, like for exploring boundaries, for understanding complex causality, for designing viable and highly responsive teams and organizations, and approaches for exploring multiple perspectives. And although all the mature approaches use all of the skills, they tend to have one dominant one. So there are various kinds of methodologies you can draw upon, like critical systems heuristics for exploring boundaries, like system dynamics for mapping interrelationships, like the viable system model for designing organizations at multiple scales. Soft systems methodology helps you understand different worldviews, different perspectives, finds new ways forward that people can live with, and you can draw it all together with the systemic intervention approach. Now, I haven't got time to go into a great deal of detail, and those are just words, but just bear in mind that there are these kinds of approaches that can be drawn upon, but fundamentally, a lot of this work is depth for special projects, whereas the fundamental systems thinking skills I introduced earlier can be used in any conversation, in any team, at any desk, for thinking through issues. And so it's a lot more flexible and responsive than a lot of the systems thinking that really dives into specialist methodologies. And that's kind of where I'm at, thinking about how systems thinking could be used in terms of systemic leadership. So shall I hand back to the chair?
Yes, thank you for your talk. I invite both of you to dialogue with one another before we open it up to the broader community. I don't know if Gemma or Gerald, if you have questions for each other or points of discussion that you want to highlight.
Would like me to start asking a question, Gerald?
Yeah, if you like, if you've got one, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask a question about the first point about boundary, the critical
Mhm.
system heuristics part. So, like boundary spanner is like a thing we talk about in this community a lot. And in the context of a team science, I'm detecting mostly two types of boundary. One is I call disciplinary boundary, and one is I call
Mhm.
organizational boundary, right? So disciplinary boundary are, like we when cross-disciplinary, right, that itself signals the boundary, right? So and
Mhm.
you see when in action, you see different people have, different discipline have different vocabulary, different mental models, different way of doing things.
Mm.
So how do you negotiate those boundaries? And then in terms of organizational boundary, how I see the play is, these scientists, they come together in this center or this institute or this project, whatever you call it. So that is a entity, an identity they have. But they all come from different organizations, and most of them are associated with different universities. So that is another system, right? So there's the organizational boundary, between the different universities they are part of and this shared project that they are part of. So how do you negotiate that boundary? And when it plays out, I see that in the tenure process, right? So a lot of the tenure process
Mm.
conflicts with the demands of the project, right? So
Mm.
if they want to get tenure, they need to reduce their investment in the project. And then in the time investment, bureaucratic organizations are so demanding of their time, they just have no time for work on the project, right? So and then in so the different ways, like in very practical ways, these boundaries show up in how scientists work together in a team science setting. So I'm just wondering, what are your advice in how we negotiate these boundaries skillfully so that they can participate effectively in team science projects?
Mm. So I use the term boundary. Certainly, I recognize the kind of boundaries you're talking about. I've encountered them in in many different contexts, even to the point when I used to work in government in New Zealand, where we used to have to run our projects using SAP, which meant that interdisciplinary dialogue, there was no code for it in the system. You had to find some way to have that outside of a project context, which was very destructive to collaboration.
Mm.
Um, so I certainly recognize those things, but I also use boundaries in a um, in a much more sort of ubiquitous way, to mean any kind of enabling constraint that we have in our ways of thinking. So we're always partial in what we're working. So the kinds of institutional constraints you're talking about there certainly need to be tackled. But
Mm.
one of the principles that I like to work with is that if we talk about transcending boundaries or spanning boundaries, we always have to be aware that we're creating a new boundary that enables that to happen.
Mm.
So we never get to the comprehensive view that takes in everybody's perspectives, and it's always a point of negotiation. That's really important because if you don't realize that, then you get into a situation where you think that you're transcending boundaries, and it's wonderful. But then you find you're marginalizing other people, or you're missing issues that because there's a groupthink among the people that you've got. So there's needs to be this constant process of probing boundaries, thinking about different possible boundaries that without being so all-encompassing that you end up paralyzing action, because obviously there's a kind of balance between exploration of boundaries and and so doing things like stakeholder analyses, um, maintaining dialogues with people outside your current boundaries, finding ways to explore diversity in ways that kind of explore the different possible changes that people can make to their boundaries, thinking about different perspectives that matter to the system. What does this thing that we're talking about interact with? What actually makes what we're working on emerge? So you're kind of probing around what's possible, and to just keep those kinds of things alive in conversations, so it doesn't stultify and create more problems in the long term.
I really,
That's
yes, I really
where
love. Yeah, a few key takeaways. One is the dynamic nature of this, right? It's not a fixed thing
Mm,
that we got to figure it once for all. It's dynamic.
mm,
And two is that like a boundary necessarily includes and excludes. So that the inclusion
mm,
and exclusion dynamic needs to be paid attention both. We can only say we set this boundary, who's included. We also need to think about who is
yeah,
excluded, what is
yeah,
excluded. That's the second.
yes,
And the third, I love the reframing of boundary as an enabling constraint. That was such a complexity thing, right? So constraint can
yeah,
enable. Don't think of boundary as the obstacle that stops you. It can enable
yeah,
as well, depending on how you use it.
yeah, yeah. And I would say all boundaries enable as well as constrain, and then we just have to look at what we're enabling and what we're constraining. Because sometimes the most productive team relationships can be exclusive of something really important. We've got to really test that as an issue.
Yes.
So I've got a question for you as well. In particular, because we had a like a 10-minute discussion before we came online here, and one of the things that we realized is that that idea that you put towards the end of that kind of space, the adaptive space, um, is also in some systems thinking, and particularly the viable system model, which talks about organizations and how organizations necessarily have to deal with the tension between maintaining business as usual, like service delivery or product manufacturing, whatever it is, and strategic foresight and change in order to adapt to changing circumstances. And that's a continuous tension that has to be managed productively. And that's in complexity work in yours. It's there in systems thinking too. I'm interested in community development and not just organizations. Now, do you think that process exists at other scales and not just within organizations? Do you think it exists at community scales or at other scales?
Yes, I think it's universal. I think if we take it out of the organization, we see the bare bone. What the model is about is about how we negotiate the tension between the tendency wanting to change and the tendency wanting to stay stable, right? So that is like
Mm,
in each one of us individual. What is the new thing we would like to do, and what is the core identity that we want to remain, right? So and then
mm,
that certainly shows up in community as well. That's why in complexity we say
mm,
context is king, right? So the different
mm,
context, it shows that we need to navigate the tension differently, but the tension itself is universal.
mm. So can you talk a little bit about some of the other polarities you work with? Because I think that notion of polarity you apply quite widely.
Yes, yes. I put in the chat, I'm writing a book exactly about this. So, yeah, my book has 12 chapters, and each chapter explores a polarity. So the ones that are, closer to personal life, for example, hope, reality, right? So that's what I was just writing about. So how do we be respectful of reality where we are while remaining hopeful, and how we navigate that polarity. Another one I wrote about is accept, assert. How can we accept what it is while asserting our will? That's like the serenity prayer. God help me
Mm,
accept what I cannot change and change what I can, and have the wisdom to know the difference. Right? So and then the one that is closer to our topic today is the first chapter of my book is what I talk about complexity, simplicity, right? So when I was there's just a quick story. When I was a doctoral student studying complex leadership, I was so excited about all the wonderful, branches of complexity. And I was talking with my aunt, who is my wisdom guru, and she's really into, the Tao tradition. And she just said one sentence that really grounded me then and until now. And she said, "You just remember this." She said, "You cannot understand complexity without understanding simplicity." Right? So that
mm,
is the polarity there, simplicity, complexity. Because that was, my doctoral advisor, Dr. Marion said, my definition of intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns. What are patterns? Patterns is a simplicity. We think about all theories we're trying to glean from the complexity a simple pattern that our intelligence can understand, that we can exercise our agency to influence the pattern. So that was just a few examples. I really see it as a universal tension that is very much a mechanism of life, like day and night, hot and cold, right? So masculine and feminine, that's the uh how life continues. So, and then more specifically, how it shows up in the human life, individual, team, organization systems.
Mm. So this reminds me a little of the work of one of my um, ex-PhD students who's now a colleague, and he's written a book called Immersive Systemic Knowing. His name's Raghav Rajagopalan, and he's drawn on Indian philosophy, and he talks about the relationship between striving and abiding.
Yes.
And he criticized my work on systemic intervention because I started from the perspective that it's impossible to it's part of the human condition that we cannot avoid intervention. Even if we choose not to act, we're intervening because we're not doing something else. So I framed everything in terms of intervention, and he said what you're hiding there is abiding, because you're removing that tension by framing abiding in terms of intervention. And so
Mm,
that he's really he's forged a different path from me, and I just a lot to learn from there.
beautiful. That is like the accept assert. Abiding is kind of like accept, and right, the intervention is the assert. That is how kind of how I see the polarity plays in that. In
Mm,
that.
yeah, that makes sense. So I think I've asked. Well, no, I did want to ask one more question actually, and it's around the the liminality you talked about, that space, how fluid it is.
Yeah.
Because for me, the systems idea is not limited to stable entities. That certainly was the case back in the 1960s. People used to use the systems idea to mean a stable organization, for example, when open system theory was applied to organizations. It was very much looked upon as stable entities. But now the systems idea is used really, it can be a brief, fluid understanding that changes just a moment later.
Mm.
So I'm wondering if there's a convergence there in your understanding of space and my understanding of system, or whether you think the systems idea is still too static.
I would say the word system has evolved quite a lot. When Dr. Marion was developing the complex leadership theory, he said he built upon a lot about Peterson Gates system dynamic field. And
Mm,
at that time, the system was more tend more to the stable part of it, right? So now
mm,
we say, okay, you meet somebody in the elevator, and in the elevator ride, you form a system, right? So there's a
mm,
lot more fluidity and dynamic aspect added
mm,
to the system. So I would say at this point in the intellectual lineage almost converged. You almost can't tell the difference. But
mm,
you are a lot more versed than this in the system development. I would say like maybe 20, 30 years ago, system does tend to more to the stable part.
mm. Yeah, I mean, from my point of view as well, I use the systems idea to explore different possibilities for understanding, anticipating, to feeling a way through the system. And so to me, it has to be that fluid. It has to be about sometimes temporary negotiated understanding. Sometimes it's momentary individual understanding. It has to be like that, because if it's a mode of understanding and exploration, if it's all about exploration, then it can change at any moment. And then you've got that tension between stability and change that you're talking about, where people can sometimes be resistant to change, and you have to work out what's going on there, and sometimes it's a good thing that people resist change, and sometimes it's something that has to be worked with.
Yes, yes, yes. And I would say the point I landed at is the me we polarity. so or we see
Mm,
individual collective polarity. So I would say, especially in the Western world that is more individualistic, so putting a spotlight
mm,
on the we, through system thinking, complexity, or whatever, those are all fall in the we bucket. It's how do we tend to
mm,
the need of the collective, right? So while
mm,
maintaining the individual autonomy and the uniqueness. So that's kind of
mm.
how I see the synergy and the convergence.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um,
I hate to interrupt this fantastic
yeah,
discussion, but I want to make sure we give the community time to
yeah, absolutely.
ask their questions and give any reflections that they may have. So you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can put it in the chat and I'll read it out for you.
Yeah, just to let people know, I can't see
Anyone
the
has any
chat because
questions?
there's a big shine on my screen. So yeah, reading out is necessary.
We've had several comments from Jim Foley. I wonder, Jim, if you'd like to join in and offer some reflection to Gemma and Gerald, or we're happy to kind of go over and summarize some of the reflections that you put in the chat if you don't jump on.
Uh, sure. So, Gerald, it's nice to interact with you
Hi.
directly. I just found out about this right before I was getting started. I've been adding some running commentary to the points you're making. It looks like, Gemma, you were able to see my comments as they were popping in, because
Yes.
I saw some of your reactions to some of them. Because I've been throughout my career trying to merge understandings of complexity theory and I just happen to have it in a stack on my kitchen table.
Mm.
This book from like 25 years ago on management and complexity science. So I hope someone's able to paste my comments to Gerald, because I just comment on, as a community organizer, I think there are similar processes across levels, as you mentioned, Gerald. Although I see this more in complexity theory terms, partly because when you're doing community organization, which I used to do, the boundaries aren't formed yet. You're doing social
Mhm.
networking, so you don't necessarily have a system yet, and yet emergent things are happening.
Mm.
And but
Yes,
I guess
for me that. Oh, sorry. Carry on.
like I guess I want hoping that I want to use my limited time to share a leadership anecdote which might be illustrative
Mm.
that merges the two fields. I used to do team building trainings, and I did one exercise where people have to tie themselves in a knot and untangle the knot. And I grouped people in this nonprofit organization that was having leadership struggles. And I've demonstrated for the large group that the teams that incorporated multiple perspectives solved the problem better than teams where one person told everyone what to do. And
Yeah.
so it really fits things that you guys have been saying today, that incorporating multiple perspectives, diverse perspectives, not only is a good thing ethically, but it's a good thing functionally. And
Yeah.
it's fits another comment I made, that where complex adaptive nonlinear dynamics can make things suddenly gel and maybe be the mechanism for the emergence that systems theory acknowledges. So I'm sure there's other questions, but I wanted to at least squeeze in that story that might illustrate something related to leadership that relates to both systems theory and complex
That's
adaptive
that.
systems.
Yeah, that's really valuable. It's my feeling is that there's value also in um, detaching those systems thinking skills from the idea of system as the real world thing, because that then allows you, for example, to use the boundary idea to think about boundaries of who could be involved, who is not currently interacting with others. So the same idea, the boundary idea, suddenly matters in a future orientated way. And the example that springs to mind is doing a consultancy in Peru in 1992. It was about the privatization of the Central Water Company. And I realized very quickly that there was a groupthink going on amongst the senior leadership team. And I just thought water is an ecological resource. We haven't got an ecologist in here. We need to get one in. And we did. And that solved their problem. They were saying, do they have jobs at the end after privatization? And the answer was, well, the ecologists showed how the water system could get polluted. And they hadn't considered that. And once they realized they needed monitoring for pollution, they realized there had to be a role for an independent statutory body. Um, and there were no interactions. No, that ecologist didn't know them. They didn't know her before we introduced her into it. And so you can use those concepts like boundaries and perspectives and relationships much more flexibly than just simply looking for a stable system.
Oh, thank you. So we do have a raised hand, and I want to highlight, Blake, before I call on you, that Kenan put a comment in the chat that said, it seems to me that part of the fluid, rigid conversation can fit into a Kenevan model. So maybe take a look at the chat at some point, if Gerald or Gemma, if you wanted to comment on that briefly. I want to make sure that we get to Blake's question.
Yeah, the Canadian framework is one of the foundational in complex designs, really distinguish complicated mechanical system from complex adaptive system. So I would say it's very relevant.
Great. Blake.
I just put, can I quickly come in?
Sure.
I just wanted to say, I think you just have to be careful how you use the framework. And I know David Snowden is quite okay, understands this. But the same system can be looked on as simple or highly complex from different perspectives. So I've worked with a policymaker, for example, who was dealing with massive complexity around biosecurity and demonstrations on the street and asking me for help because he didn't know how to deal with it. But fundamentally, his perspective was, I'm right and they're wrong. So you really have to not just take what people say is the diagnosis, but really work with it and explore it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, the key distinguishing factor is whether interaction leads to change and whether we can determine the direction of the change, right? So in the Canadian framework, the left part is emergent. Is interaction leads to change, we don't know the direction of change. And the right part is interaction does not lead to change. So there is a control and prediction possible. So to me, that is the key differences. That's where the fluid rigidity kind of comes from.
A great
Sorry.
reflection. Would love, I want to make sure we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to make sure that Blake gets a chance to ask his question. Go ahead, Blake.
Well, maybe this is a good last question. Gemma, I was just wondering, when you were talking about enabling leadership, that framework on the adaptive spaces, I didn't hear you mention much about it. And I was wondering if there's any sort of sound bites you can share about what enabling leadership style is, or what you meant by that.
So like the closest I can say, I have one of my I2 Insights contribution is defining boundary spanners as exercising enabling leadership.
So
right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right, so that the interdisciplinary translators. So basically, the kind of people that bring differences together and help with the integration, I would say all broadly fall into enabling leadership. Because you say in team science, we have administrative leaders, they are the senior leaders, right? So they have the title of the director, this or that. That is acknowledged. The entrepreneurial leaders, they are the scientists pushing the boundary of knowing, and they are rewarded with their tenure, their publication, all those things, right? So in the middle are the people who are doing the translational work, doing the integration work, right? They are exercising enabling leadership, and they are not acknowledged. A lot of them are invisible labor, emotional labor, right? So I really just wanted to say these people are also exercising a type of leadership. It's called enabling leadership, and they need to be acknowledged, rewarded, and enabled so that we can truly do team science work.
See, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, everyone. This is our last session here, and of this particular series where we've been celebrating the 10th anniversary of the I2 Insights blog and repository. And we want to again thank Gabrielle Bamer and Peter Dean for allowing us to celebrate this amazing resource for everyone. And it was such a pleasure. This has just been a great series, and the model that you all, Gemma and Gerald, went through today of these dyads, these dialogue discussions, have just been so rewarding and have yielded so many great insights. So thanks to the two of you and to all of our speakers over the course of the season of the series. So you will hear from us again sometime this summer with the plans for the next seminar series. And I want to give everyone a heads up that we are actually going to change things around for the next series and actually for InterReach as well moving forward. We understand that we've had our systems are aging out, so our listserv, our website, a lot of those things need to be updated. So we're recognizing that, and we're exploring kind of a transition plan for having systems that work a little bit better, and also just growing as a community of practice. So be on the lookout for communications from us on what that will look like, and we may be soliciting input from our InterReach community here. But I will end there and just say thank you, everyone, for taking the time to attend today, and for our regular attendees. We really appreciate your engagement over the course of the series. So I will send you on your way to enjoy more of this summer or winter time, depending on where you're calling in from. And we will post the recording for this up on the InterReach website in our archived webinars sometime over the next week. So once again, thanks everyone, and take care and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your season.